Gerald Whitfield sat at the kitchen table at 4:47 in the morning, with 4 envelopes in front of him, and the specific stillness of a man who has already made the decision and is now simply waiting for the world to catch up to it. His daughter Maeve was asleep upstairs. His son-in-law Decker, too. His youngest Cam had the guest room down the hall. His oldest Porter had driven in from Phoenix and was on the pull-out couch in the office. None of them knew. That was the point. By the time the coffee finished brewing and Gerald had poured himself a cup and stood at the window watching the Phoenix skyline. No Denver, where he had built everything, where the cold came in off the mountains in November like a creditor. They would wake up to envelopes and a gate code that no longer worked and cards that declined on the first try. 40 years in commercial real estate, 14 office buildings, 3 mixed-use developments, a portfolio worth somewhere north of $900 million depending on which quarter you asked. Gerald had started with a salvage license, a truck he didn't fully own, and a storage unit in Aurora where he kept the things he couldn't afford to lose. He knew what it felt like to buy groceries in 2 separate transactions because he wasn't sure the card would clear the full amount. He knew the particular arithmetic of a man who counts backward from the end of the month and finds the numbers don't reach. His children did not know this arithmetic. He had made sure of it. He had made sure of everything, the schools, the cars, the safety net so seamless it was invisible, and that was exactly the problem. You couldn't see what you'd never had to look for. There were 4 envelopes, $80 in each. 1 week. He did not leave a note. Maeve was 38. She had a master's degree in organizational leadership from a school Gerald had paid for in full, a title at Whitfield Properties, Director of Community Relations. That meant roughly what she decided it meant on any given day, and a husband, Decker, who had been brought into the company 4 years ago at Maeve's request, and had since developed a talent for sitting at the head of tables and speaking in a way that sounded like conclusion but wasn't. Porter was 36. He had grown up the way certain eldest children grow up in wealthy families, with the assumption that the world was organized in his favor, that rooms would open when he arrived, that other people's hesitations were obstacles rather than information. He had a business degree and managed a subset of the company's residential holdings from an office in Phoenix where he spent most of his time on the phone, and very little of it looking at what the phone calls actually produced. Cam was 29. He had come back from 2 years of traveling. Southeast Asia, then South America, then some months that weren't clearly accounted for, and was now in Gerald's house for the 3rd time this year, figuring out his next move. Cam had never lacked for ideas about his next move. He had lacked for follow-through in the specific and sustained way that comfortable people lack for follow-through, because the floor was always there, waiting, whenever the idea collapsed. And then there was Maeve's stepdaughter, Isla, 26. She was not Gerald's blood. Her mother had married Decker when Isla was 9. And when that marriage ended, Isla had somehow remained adjacent to all of them. Showed up at holidays, texted Maeve more than Maeve's brothers did. Helped clear the table without being asked. Gerald had added a 4th envelope 3 weeks before, not without argument from himself, and then had stopped arguing. He had been watching all 4 of them for 6 months. He had not liked what he saw. Monday came gray and cold, the way Denver Novembers come, without apology. Porter found his envelope at 6 a.m. and called Gerald's cell immediately. No answer. He called again. Voicemail. He read the handwritten card inside. $80. 7 days. No cards, no house, no company resources. Your phone is for emergencies. This starts now, and held it in both hands the way you hold something that is either a joke or the most serious thing that's ever happened to you, and you can't tell yet which it is. He decided it was a joke. He got in his car. The gate didn't open. He tried the code twice, then a 3rd time. He sat in his car with the engine running for 4 minutes, which is a long time to sit with a decision you haven't made yet being made for you. Then he called Maeve. Maeve had already read hers. She was in the kitchen in her bathrobe, holding the card at arm's length, the way you read something you want to disagree with before you've finished it. Decker was at the table with his envelope unopened, moving his jaw the way he moved his jaw when he was calculating something. "He's not answering," Porter said. "I know," Maeve said. "Mine says the same thing. This is insane. He can't just—" "Porter," she was quiet for a moment. "He did. Cam didn't call anyone. He read his envelope twice, sat on the edge of the pull-out couch with his feet flat on the floor, and thought about the $80 in a focused way he hadn't thought about money in a long time. He had $80. He had a week. He had a jacket and a pair of boots and a backpack he'd never fully unpacked from the last time he'd gone somewhere. He left the house at 6:22, 18 minutes before he was required to, and walked north toward downtown with the backpack on his shoulder and no particular plan, which was, if he was honest with himself, the most familiar condition of his adult life. Isla had been in the guest bathroom when the envelopes were found. She came downstairs to Maeve and Decker at the table, and the card Maeve slid toward her without making eye contact. "He included you," Decker said. The way he said it was not generous. Isla read the card. She set it on the table. She went upstairs, packed her bag in 12 minutes, came back down and kissed Maeve on the cheek. "I'll see you in a week," she said. Maeve caught her hand. "You don't have to." "I know," Isla said. "I want to." She walked out the front door with $80 in her coat pocket. She did not look back at the house. Porter's strategy on day one was to treat the situation as a resource problem, which was the only kind of problem he had ever successfully solved. He called 6 people before noon. A college friend in Cherry Creek, out of town, a business contact from a property deal 2 years ago, didn't pick up. His ex-girlfriend from law school who still texted him on birthdays. Picked up, listened, said she was sorry but her apartment was a studio and her roommate was already there. He checked into a hostel in Capitol Hill at 2 in the afternoon, paid $45 for a bunk in a 6-person room, and sat on the thin mattress with his phone in his hand, and $35 left and the particular sensation of a man who has spent his entire life knowing what came next and now does not. The room smelled like other people's choices. There was a man across from him, maybe 60, refolding the same shirt with careful, practiced hands. Porter watched him without meaning to. The man didn't look up. That night, Porter lay in his bunk and stared at the underside of the bunk above him and made a list in his head of all the people he'd worked with over the years. The handshakes, the dinners, the names he'd collected, the way people collect business cards, as proof of presence rather than connection, and arrived, somewhere around midnight, at the unwelcome recognition that he could not identify a single one of them who would answer the phone for him and mean it. Decker had not left the house with the others. He'd watched Maeve go, told her he'd follow shortly, and then sat at the kitchen table for 40 minutes, working the problem the way he worked all problems, finding the angle, the leverage point, the place where the rules bent. He had resources Gerald didn't know about, a personal account from a consulting arrangement he'd set up 18 months ago, offshore adjacent in a way that was technically legal and practically invisible. He told himself this week was Gerald's theater. He told himself a smart man didn't play someone else's game on someone else's terms. By noon, he was at a hotel near Union Station. Not the Whitfield name, not a company card. His own money, which meant it wasn't really against the rules, which meant he hadn't really failed the test, which meant. But this reasoning grew thinner the further he followed it, and by the 3rd day he had stopped following it and was sitting in a hotel room eating room service he could afford and watching the city through the window and feeling, for reasons he couldn't locate precisely, worse than he had expected. Cam walked until his feet made the decision for him. By mid-morning he had found a day labor office on Larimer Street, the kind of place with folding chairs and a whiteboard, and men who arrived early because early was the only advantage available to them. He put his name on the list. He sat in a plastic chair and waited. The man next to him was maybe 55, with a face that had weather in it the way certain faces do, the kind of weather that lives there permanently. His name was Roland. No, not Roland. The man said Garrett, which was his last name, and Cam used it because that was how the man introduced himself. Wait, Garrett was on the list. He checked himself. The man said his name was Willard. Willard Tate. Willard had been a pipe fitter for 22 years. He explained this without drama, the way you state a credential, not because you want credit, but because it's the most efficient way to identify yourself to a stranger. His union had dissolved after a contractor dispute 2 years ago. He'd been working day labor since, not continuously, but when the right job came through and his knee allowed it. "What do you know how to do?" Willard said. Cam thought about this more seriously than he'd thought about anything in months. "I can drive," he said. "I know basic construction. I worked a warehouse once in Chiang Mai." Willard looked at him. "Chiang Mai? Thailand." "I know where Chiang Mai is," Willard said, not unkindly. "Just registering the distance between that and here." They got called for the same job. Loading and transport for a renovation site in Globeville. 8 hours. Cam worked beside Willard without talking much, which was the right instinct. He lifted what needed lifting. He moved when the job moved. By the time the truck was loaded, and they were washing their hands at the outdoor spigot in the late afternoon chill, Cam had earned $96 and spent nothing. He recorded the amount in the Notes app on his phone, which he had not opened for anything else all day, and felt, for the first time in some months, like a number that was going in the right direction. Maeve spent the first 2 days in an extended-stay motel near Colfax, the kind of place where the carpet is dark enough to hide everything, and the front desk doesn't ask questions. She had grown up in Gerald's houses, which were large and well-maintained and had rooms for every purpose. This room had one purpose and performed it adequately and nothing more. She was not managing well, but she was managing, which was different from how she'd expected to find herself. She had always thought of herself as the capable one, the one who stayed calm, who organized things, who made the calls when no one else would. But capability, she was discovering, had always operated inside a structure someone else built. Remove the structure and you found out whether you were capable or whether you were just organized. She found a temp staffing agency on Wednesday. They placed her Thursday at a data entry job in a medical billing office. $16 an hour, 8 hours. She showed up in the same clothes she'd worn Tuesday, which she had washed in the motel sink and dried on the towel bar. The woman at the next desk, Barbara, didn't comment on this. She showed Maeve the system without condescension, walked her through the codes, and checked her work at noon, with the efficiency of someone who had taught strangers to do this job many times and had stopped expecting them to be grateful. That afternoon, Barbara's granddaughter called during the break. A 10-minute call in which Barbara navigated a school pickup schedule conflict with the particular patience of a woman who is holding 4 things at once and doesn't put any of them down. Maeve watched and thought about the word capacity and what it actually meant, and whether she had it, and in what circumstances, and what it cost. By Thursday, the shape of the week had become visible. Porter had spent his remaining $35 on food and a second night at the hostel, and was now broke in the clearest sense. He'd walked twice through the Denver Central Library, not because he had anywhere to be, but because it was warm, and no one asked him why he was there. On Thursday afternoon, he sat near the periodicals and watched a woman at the circulation desk help a teenage boy find a book for a school report. She spoke to the boy in the tone of someone who believes teenagers are worth the effort, which is not a universal belief and is not without cost. The boy found his book and said thank you without looking up, the automatic courtesy of a person who's been trained to say thank you. The woman said you're welcome and meant it. Porter watched this exchange and sat with it for longer than he expected to. He had spent 11 years managing people, signing off on budgets, approving decisions. He had done none of it badly. He had also done none of it in a way that the woman at the circulation desk did what she just did, which was care about the outcome for the other person more than about the impression she was making. He wasn't sure when those two things had diverged for him. He suspected it had been gradual, and he had not noticed. Isla had found a job by Tuesday morning. She had worked barista jobs through her early 20s, between school and the stretch of time when her mother's health declined and the insurance money went, where insurance money always went, toward the part that wasn't covered. She walked into a coffee shop on East Colfax called Groundwork, asked the manager if they needed anyone, and started at 6 a.m. the next day. Her manager's name was Cecilia Voss. Mid-40s, 3 rings on her left hand that she wore on different fingers depending on which day it was. She ran the shop the way people run things they built from something real, attentive to the small things, unimpressed by performance, patient with honest mistakes and impatient with dishonest ones. Isla worked. She remembered orders. She learned names. She did the thing that certain people do in service work, which is make the interaction feel like the other person arrived at the right moment instead of an inconvenient one. On Wednesday, a man came in at 7:15 who could not make eye contact and ordered the same thing 3 times because he kept losing the thread. His hands were not quite steady. Cecilia made his drink herself without comment and set it on the counter and said his name. She knew his name, the way you say someone's name when you want them to feel located. After he left, Isla said, "Does he come in every day?" "Every day he can," Cecilia said, and went back to the register. Isla wrote nothing down. Some things don't need to be written to stay. Thursday night, each of the 4 was at a different kind of bottom. Porter sat outside the library at closing time with nowhere confirmed for the night, 0 in his pocket, and the name of a shelter on Lawrence Street that the librarian had handed him on a piece of paper, unprompted, while he was trying to figure out if he looked as lost as he felt. He held the paper in both hands in the cold and understood that he had spent 36 years being the kind of person that other people organized their generosity around, and he had never once noticed that it was generosity. Decker sat in his hotel room with the television off and the lights low and the room service tray outside the door because even eating felt like performance now, and there was no audience. He had not failed Gerald's test by conventional measure. He had money. He had a bed. He had managed the week the way he managed everything, by finding the gap in the rules and standing in it. What he had not managed, what was becoming increasingly clear as the days added up, was the question of what he was doing any of this for. He was good at acquiring things. He was good at protecting position. He had spent 4 years inside Gerald's family the way you spend time inside a building, using it, without ever thinking about what held it up. Cam slept on a cot at the shelter on Lawrence Street Thursday night. The same shelter Porter would find the next day, and lay in the dark, listening to the building settle around him, and thought about Willard Tate, who had been a pipefitter for 22 years and was now here, in this same building, 2 rows over, sleeping with his jacket folded under his head because the pillow was flat, and Willard, Cam had come to understand, did not complain about things he could solve quietly on his own. Cam had grown up being told he was creative, curious, a free spirit. These had felt like compliments. This week they had felt like a way of describing someone who never had to commit to anything because the cost of not committing was always absorbed by someone else. He lay on the cot and thought about that with more honesty than comfort, which was, he suspected, the point. Isla was not at her lowest Thursday night. She had worked 3 days at groundwork, had $180 left, more than she started with, had a place to sleep in a room she'd rented by the week above a laundromat on 13th, and had, in the course of working beside Cecilia Voss, arrived at something she hadn't had when the week started, a specific and unambiguous picture of what it looked like to run a small thing well, with care, without requiring anyone to notice. What she was turning over Thursday night was not how she had survived. It was the question of what she had been doing before. She had floated. She had showed up. She had been adjacent to Gerald's family in the way you can be adjacent to something large and mistaken its gravity for your own. Cecilia had not made that mistake. Cecilia had built something with her own weight. And it was small, and it was real, and it did not require Gerald Whitfield or anyone like him to hold it up. Isla lay in her rented room and looked at the ceiling and understood, in the quiet way that certain understandings arrive, that she had been borrowing other people's structures for a long time and calling it belonging. Friday. Porter walked into the shelter on Lawrence Street at 7 p.m. because the librarian's handwriting on the piece of paper was clear, and he had no other information. He signed in, took a mat and a blanket, and sat on the mat in a room with 14 other men, and did not, for the first time all week, Try to make himself seem like something other than where he was. The man next to him was somewhere in his 60s, sitting cross-legged reading a paperback without any particular urgency. His name, Porter, found out in the way you find out names when you're not networking. Slowly, and because you're in the same place, was Willard Tate. The same Willard Tate. The pipe fitter. They talked for an hour. Willard had grown up in Littleton, worked the same trade his father had worked, married his high school girlfriend, raised a daughter who now lived in Sacramento, and called every Sunday regardless. He had lost the job, then the apartment, then, in the way that losses accumulate when there's no margin, the car. He described all of it without self-pity, as a sequence of facts rather than a catastrophe. The way people talk about weather that's already passed. What happens after? Porter said. He wasn't sure what he meant until he heard himself ask it. Willard thought about it. You figure out what you actually need, he said. That part takes a while. Porter sat with that then. What do you actually need? Willard looked at him. To be useful, he said. Something to do that matters to someone. A place to sleep where you're not wondering. He paused. The rest is extra. Porter did not write this down. He was not the kind of person who wrote things down. But it stayed. Saturday. Cam went back to the labor office, but not for himself. He went because Willard had mentioned the week before that the Globeville site was looking for a second crew and the job paid out in cash Fridays. Willard's knee had been bad since Wednesday. He wasn't on any list. Cam put Willard's name on the list with his own and told the dispatcher Willard was available for light work, sorting and staging, which was true, and that he'd worked pipe fitting for 2 decades, which was also true, and mattered more than the knee. Willard got the work. He didn't ask how his name got on the list. That afternoon, Cam used some of what he had earned to buy a knee brace from a pharmacy on Welton Street. He left it on Willard's mat at the shelter with no note, because a note would have required something from Willard that Willard hadn't offered. And Cam was learning, slowly, and at some cost to his previous self-image, the difference between generosity and performance. Maeve's last day on the data entry job was Friday. She stayed an extra 30 minutes to finish a batch she hadn't been asked to finish, and Barbara noticed because Barbara noticed everything, and said, "You didn't have to stay." "I know," Maeve said. On the walk back to the motel, Maeve passed a city recreation center that had a sign in the window, Job Skills Workshop. Free, Tuesdays 6 p.m. She stopped and looked at the sign for a moment. She thought about the Director of Community Relations title she held at Whitfield Properties. What it actually meant. What she actually did with it. Whether the community in question had ever been given anything other than a press release. She took a photo of the sign with her phone. Monday. Gerald opened the gate at 6 a.m. Porter came back at 10. He set his key on the kitchen counter with a deliberateness that Gerald recognized. The motion of a man putting something down that he's decided to examine rather than keep carrying. He said he'd stayed at a shelter 2 nights. He did not say it the way he would have said it a week ago, which was with the disclaimer already attached. He just said it. Gerald poured him coffee. He let the silence run. "I met someone," Porter said finally. "A man named Willard, pipe fitter." Gerald waited. "I think I need to actually do something," Porter said. He stopped. Then, "I don't know what that means yet. But I know the thing I've been doing isn't it," Gerald said. "That's an honest sentence." Porter nodded. He did not add to it. Decker came through the front door at 11:40. He set nothing on the table. He stood in the middle of the kitchen with his jacket on and said, "I didn't do it right." His voice had none of the quality Gerald associated with him. The smoothness, the professional polish, the air of a man who has already considered the room before he speaks. "I used money I had set aside, a separate account." He said this looking directly at Gerald, which took something. "I slept in a hotel." Gerald looked at his son-in-law for a long time. "I know," he said. Decker blinked. "I've known about the account for 8 months, Gerald said. "Not with heat, not with satisfaction, just as a fact. I didn't cancel it." Decker sat down. "Why not?" "Because I wanted to see what you'd do when the choice was yours alone and no one was watching." Gerald poured a second cup and set it in front of Decker. What I'm seeing right now is the first honest thing you've done in 4 years in this house." He sat down across from him. "That's not nothing." Decker looked at the cup. He did not speak for a long time. When he did, his voice was different, quieter, slower, as though he was locating words that had been there for a while without being used. "I don't know what I'm doing here," he said, "at the company. In this family. I came in because of Maeve, and then I stayed because—" He stopped. "I don't know why I stayed. I kept being useful in ways that weren't really useful, and no one said stop." "I'm saying it now," Gerald said, not unkindly. Maeve came in at 1:15, still carrying the temp agency paperwork she'd forgotten to leave at the office. She set her bag on the floor, sat down at the table, and put the photo of the recreation center sign in front of Gerald. "I want to run the community relations function like it actually means something," she said. "Not press releases, real programs. This is one idea." Gerald looked at the photo. He looked at his daughter, at the difference in her posture from a week ago, a settling, a solidity that had not been there before. "Tell me," he said. She did. For 35 minutes she talked about what the job could actually be, names she'd gotten from Barbara, a contact at Denver Housing Authority, what a genuine skills workshop partnership might look like if it was funded with intention and run like something that mattered to the people inside it rather than to the press coverage outside it. Gerald listened. He asked 3 questions. All 3 were real questions, not the rhetorical kind he usually asked in meetings, where he already had the answers, and the question was a demonstration. When she finished, he said, "You can have a budget for a pilot by the end of the year." "I want it to be separate from the company's PR function," she said. Done. Cam came in at 4:30 with $214, more than he'd started with. He set the cash on the table and then set something else beside it. A folded piece of paper, Willard Tate's name and the Lawrence Street shelter address, written in Cam's handwriting, with a note that read, 22 years of pipe fitting. Looking for consistent work. Good with teaching. His knee needs some accommodation, but his hands don't. Gerald picked up the paper and read it twice. "He's at the shelter most evenings," Cam said. "I told him I might be in touch. I didn't promise anything." "Why not?" Cam thought about it. "Because a promise I can't guarantee is just another thing I'm doing for myself," he said. Gerald set the paper down. He looked at his youngest child, at the specific quality that had been absent from Cam for as long as Gerald could remember. The quality of someone who is present to something outside himself and knows it and isn't performing the knowledge. "That's the hardest thing you've ever said," Gerald told him. Cam shrugged, but not the way he used to shrug, not the shrug of someone's exiting a conversation. "It's just true," he said. Isla came last at 5:50. She set an envelope on the table, not the original one, a new envelope, with $90 inside it. She kept $10 for the bus. Gerald did not look at the money. He looked at her. "How was it?" he said. "Good," she said. And then, because he was still looking, "I worked for someone who does things right. It was useful to watch." Gerald nodded slowly. He took out his wallet, not to give her anything, just to set it on the table. The motion said, "We're talking as equals." "What did she teach you?" "She didn't teach me anything directly," Isla said. "She just did the work in front of me." She paused. "I think that might be better." Gerald was quiet for a moment. "Cecilia Voss," he said, "on East Colfax." Isla looked at him. "You know her?" "I know the building. I've known it for 12 years. Good corner. She's had it for 8. He paused. "I offered to buy her out once. She said she didn't need a partner. She needed a new grease trap." He allowed himself something that was not quite a smile. "I sent her a grease trap." Isla looked at him for a long time. "You've been watching longer than this week." "Yes," Gerald said. She sat down. She did not reach for the envelope. She understood it wasn't being returned yet. It was being placed on the table to see whether the two of them, her and Gerald, were looking at the same thing. They were. The following Tuesday, Gerald drove alone to the Lawrence Street shelter. Willard Tate was at a table near the window, eating with the methodical care of someone who has learned not to rush meals. Gerald sat across from him and introduced himself by his first name only. They talked for 40 minutes. Gerald asked about the pipe fitting, the union situation, the knee. Willard answered, without embellishment, the way men answer when they've stopped caring whether the answer sounds good. At the end, Gerald told him about the Globeville site, and the 3 other sites, and the fact that Whitfield Properties had no one on staff who could train the younger crew members in trade work because they had outsourced that knowledge gradually over a decade and were now paying for the gap. Interested? Gerald said. Willard looked at him. What's the accommodation for the knee? Gerald said he could work that out. He said it simply, not as a gift, as a logistics problem. Willard said he'd think about it. He did not say yes immediately. Gerald had not expected him to. He had expected this, a man who took time with decisions because he had learned what hasty ones cost. He drove back through Denver in the November afternoon, the light coming low and sideways off the Rockies the way it did in fall, long and specific and unhurried. He had not told any of his children that he was doing this. He had not held a family meeting. He had not delivered a speech at a scenic overlook. He had gone to see a man who deserved to be seen. The Whitfield Properties Trade Work Apprenticeship Program launched the following spring, small and without ceremony. 8 participants the first cohort. Willard ran 2 sessions a week. He taught the way he built things, not with instruction manuals but with demonstration, hand over hand when necessary, and the constant reminder that you measured twice not because the tape lied, but because you owed the work that much respect. Porter took on the coordination of the program alongside his existing role, which he had restructured over 4 months, with Gerald's approval, transferring 3 titles to people who had been doing the actual work behind them for years. He still wore the Oxford shoes. He walked more now. He had learned the distance between the Globeville site and the Larimer Street office in feet, which was a different way of knowing a city than knowing it in minutes by car. Decker left the company in February. It was a mutual decision reached in a series of direct conversations that contained none of the smoothness of his usual operating mode. He and Maeve stayed together. They were, in ways neither had expected, better at it without the structure of the company between them. He found work as an independent consultant for a mid-sized development firm in Boulder. He was good at it. He was good at it differently than before. Maeve's pilot program launched with a budget of $180,000 and 3 partner organizations, one of which was Barbara's Church, which ran a Thursday night job readiness workshop that had been operating for 9 years with no outside support. Maeve attended the first 3 sessions to learn the room before she tried to change it. Cam moved into an apartment 2 miles from the Globeville site in March and started working the apprenticeship program as a coordinator, specifically the logistics that Willard had no patience for, which was most of the logistics. They were a functional pair. Willard thought Cam talked too much. Cam thought Willard didn't talk enough. The work got done. Isla did not come to work for Whitfield Properties. She stayed at groundwork. She was managing the morning shift by spring, and Cecilia was training her on the back-end operations with the same quiet efficiency she trained everything, by doing it in front of someone who was paying attention. Isla was paying attention. Gerald ate breakfast there every other Thursday. He ordered the same thing. He tipped well, not ostentatiously, the way you tip when you know what the job costs. He and Isla talked for maybe 15 minutes each time, about the shop, about the program, about nothing much. It was enough. Some things don't need more structure than they already have. The following November, Gerald sat at Walter Caldwell's desk. No, at his own desk, his grandfather's desk that he had moved from storage to the study the year after his wife died, the desk with the shallow top drawer that held nothing now. He had cleared it in September. He was still not sure what to put back. He had built a real estate company worth $900 million. He had learned, across 9 decades of combined effort from the people in his family and the people not in his family, that the measure of what he had built was not in the appraisal value, but in Willard Tate, arriving 12 minutes early every Tuesday because the first session started at 8, and Willard held that 8 the way he held everything worth holding, as a commitment, not a convenience. It was in a son who had learned the distance between 2 places in feet. It was in a daughter who attended someone else's meeting for 3 weeks before she tried to change it. It was in Cam's handwriting on a folded piece of paper. His hands don't. And it was in Isla, who had looked at what Gerald offered and chosen to stay where she was, in a small shop on East Colfax that opened at 6 in the morning, because that was when people needed it open, and had said, by staying, something about what belonging actually required that Gerald had not found a way to say in 71 years of trying. He closed the desk drawer. Outside, Denver moved through the afternoon at its own pace, indifferent and full, carrying the weight of ordinary things that no one was keeping score of. For the first time in longer than he could trace, Gerald Whitfield was not keeping score either.